Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 107 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, my longtime co-host John Joseph Adams will be stopping by to discuss his new anthology Robot Uprisings, which he co-edited with author and robot expert Daniel H. Wilson, who will also be joining us. But first up, we've got an interview with author Elizabeth Bear, who recently concluded her Eternal Sky Trilogy, which Tor.com calls the most significant epic fantasy published in the last decade. And now, here's our interview with Elizabeth Bear. All right, so we're here with Elizabeth Bear. Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
All right, and so your new books are the Eternal Sky Trilogy. You want to just tell us how these came about?
The first book, Range of Ghosts, which was out in 2012. Yes, 2012. Was written in part. I should say that these are what a friend of mine calls Silk Road fantasy. They're an epic fantasy set in Central Asia and Eurasia, not our Central Asia and Eurasia, but a parallel one, a different history, but a similar part of the world. And I wanted to do something that was a little bit different from the sort of standard, generic European fantasy setting. And part of that is because of my very good friend, Asha Srinivasan Shipman, who is obviously of Indian descent and had mentioned to me that she wished she could find more fantasy that reflected her heritage. And it turns out that on my side, through my my Cossack ancestors, because I'm Ukrainian on my father's side, and on her side, we're both descended from the Mongol horde. And in fact, she's a many times great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan. And this is actually historically documented, and there are genealogical. Of course, apparently 1 out of 20% of humanity is also descended from Genghis Khan. So it's not that rare. He got around. So I thought it would be really neat to write a book, sort of reflecting that, write a book for her and for her sons, and also, for, just sort of reflecting that common heritage that she and I have. That was the thing that first put me into it. And then I started reading, extensively about the history of the Mongol empires and various other empires in, the Tibetan Plateau and what is now Kazakhstan, and this amazing, sweeping, deeply storied part of the world, and got very captivated by it.
And so when you were, dreaming up this setting, what sort of research did you do? Were there any books that were particularly helpful? Oh,
gosh, yes. There is there's actually been a renaissance in the Western study of Mongolian history in the past 50 years, in part driven by the fact that a document called The Secret History basically was uncovered. It's a family history written by someone in Genghis Khan's household. And a copy of this document was found in China. And it's basically like an intimate personal portrait from an insider. And this has spawned a whole plethora of books, some better than others. I'm very, very fond of, there's a book called The Secret History of the Mongol Queens, which talks about his daughters-in-law and granddaughters-in-law who did a lot of the work of keeping the empire going after he died. Oh God, I don't even know. I read so many books. But I want to stress that this isn't a historical fantasy. It's a historically inspired fantasy. I have written rigorously researched historical fantasy, set in our world, and this is not that.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, why don't you give us an idea of what aspects of the book are drawn from the actual history and what are invented?
Well, the societies in the book, and there are a number of them, are loosely based, or I wouldn't even say based, possibly inspired by various Earth cultures. Although some of them are really invented out of whole cloth. This is a world where, because of a historical event that hasn't been revealed yet, but maybe I will get the chance to write about some way, there essentially is no Western Europe. So there's a cognate to the British Isles, and there's a cognate to Scandinavia, but essentially the continent of Europe ends roughly around Prague, which means that basically all of those cultural and historical influences in our world are just non-existent. There are no Romans. There really are no Greeks, which leads to a very different cultural path and historical path. The Abrahamic religions don't exist in this world. None of our major world religions exist. The closest thing that they come to is there's one theocracy that is the caliphate, the worship of the scholar god, who's the closest thing that they have to what we would consider sort of an Abrahamic god. The inspiration for my protagonist's life story, basically, he's a younger son of a cadet branch of the imperial family, and there's been a civil war going on for some time when the first book starts. And he's just decided that basically his entire family has been wiped out. He wakes up on a battlefield and he decides, this is it. I'm out of it. I'm going to go be a farmer. I've had enough of this. And history and fate being what they are, he's not really allowed to pursue his quiet life as a sheep herder for very long.
The author being who she is.
The author being a horrible troublemaker. He runs afoul of a necromancer who is the theocrat of a minor sect of a different religion, who very much wants to put himself into a position of political power. And because he doesn't have a lot of temporal power, how he decides to do this is by manipulating and controlling other people.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so you say there are necromancers, and there's all sorts of magic in the book.
Yes.
Maybe we should just start and talk about, why is it called the Eternal Sky Trilogy?
Well, that's one of the things that I was thinking about, and my training is as an anthropologist. And one of the things that they hammer into you as an anthropologist in the modern era, and some of this is because, especially, in the Victorian era and the Edwardian era, anthropology made so many horrible, horrible mistakes and was used as a justification for just incredibly awful human rights abuses. The discipline and the science these days is profoundly self-conscious of those mistakes, and in attempting to inculcate in its students this idea of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, and how the habits and prejudices of your tribe are just that. And what I take as that basically in teaching people that what they were raised to believe were sacred and inviolable truths are actually just the habits of your tribe. And I thought it would be really neat to create a world in which not only is magic real, and are there actual gods who actually have sway over various spheres of influence and various geographical areas, but that there was an external physical manifestation of that. So literally, when you move from the sphere of influence of one god to the sphere of influence of another, the sky changes. You are under the sky of a different god. The sky is a different color in this world. When I first thought of it, I was like, this is a really cool thing. This is flashy. It's an eyeball kick. It'll be so much fun. And then I realized that it was incredibly emotionally important, not just to the characters, but also to the readers. And that there were emotional beats in those moments when you came home to your own sky. And I mean, in our world, we have a lesser version of this. I remember when I grew up in New England and moved to the Nevada desert for about 7 years, and then came back to Connecticut. And I remember when I moved out there, just being impressed by how it really seemed like a whole different sky. It doesn't seem like they can be contiguous, the sun and sky of Nevada and the sun and sky of Connecticut. They don't seem like they're the same thing, even though they are.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because the protagonist, Timur, the sky is almost like a newspaper or something for him, because it gives him very personal news updates.
Yes, because the sky in the Khaganate reflects the composition of the royal family, so you can sort of check in on your relatives. And because it's a slightly sexist society, it only reflects male relatives, because they're the ones who are in line to be heirs to the throne. But yes, the gods, the heavens actually do take an interest in you.
Okay, so that's Timur, the protagonist, but there are a bunch of other characters in this book. You want to tell us about some of the other characters?
Sure. I have my personal favorite character is probably Rahma, who is a giant anthropomorphic badass tiger monk. An atheist tiger monk, because she's broken up with her god, which is hard to do when your god has an objective reality. Mm-hmm. But she's bitter about some things that happened to her in the past, and she's not talking to her deity anymore. Then there's Samarkar, who is a former princess of the high plateau society that is sort of cognate to the Tibetan Empire. And I took a lot of liberties in when and where various empires happened, because the Tibetan Empire predated the Mongolian Empire by a whole bunch of centuries. But in this reality, their cognates are coexisting. And Samarkar is one of the people who is most closely based on a real historical figure. Her backstory is very close to what happened to the Tibetan princess Samarkar. Although the Tibetan princess Samarkar did not go on to become a wizard. Screw you guys, I'm going to wizarding school. But I think she probably would have if she'd had the opportunity.
Well, yeah. Why don't you tell us about the wizard school? Because this is not exactly Hogwarts in this.
No, there are a bunch of different traditions of wizardry. Pretty much every culture has its own type of magic. So the Karsnik, the people of the Khaganate, have shamans, and the Rasani, who are the people who are most closely based on the Tibetan Empire, have their wizardry is a craft that involves a lot of science. They have attempted to understand things like how gunpowder works and how plants grow and how disease works, and they have for their time period fairly advanced knowledge of surgery, for example, which is useful because the way you come into your power as a wizard in this particular tradition is by giving up your power to generate life, to have children. So spay or neuter your wizard, essentially.
I mean, could with the giving up your ability to have children to be able to do magic, could you just talk about how that idea came to you or how you developed that idea?
That was one of those things that came up in conversation with a group of friends. Like fellow writers, we were talking about the idea of sacrifice or magic through sacrifice. And one of the common tropes is that magicians, especially female magicians, have to preserve their virginity or chastity in order to create magic. And we were like, what if there's, it would be the biggest reasonable gamble somebody would take, because even after the way this initiation works is that they go through the training and then they have, the neutering surgery, and then they have to go through an initiation to see if they actually get any power. So even if they survive the surgery, there's no guarantee that they're going to gain magic. And that seemed like one of the biggest gambles you could possibly take. But also, if you were trying to get out of a dynastic situation, which Samarkand, the female protagonist, is trying to do, she's trying to remove herself from the succession so that she won't be a royal pawn, then getting rid of your ability to have children is convenient.
I mean, it seems to me that a lot of times in fantasy that the ideas that have power are things that relate to people's actual lives.
Yeah.
And certainly just a lot of fantasy writers I know, this is a very real issue, right? Like, can you pursue your artistic career and have kids at the same time in terms of money and time? And I think for everybody, there's just sort of this balance between work and family. And can you have both?
Yes.
I mean, were you thinking of that at all when you were writing, or?
I was not thinking about that at the time, but it's something that I've thought about for myself, as a woman and as a professional. And I made the decision not to have children personally, but I hadn't actually. That's really interesting. I hadn't actually thought of that before. Good on you, smart critic.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, and I also wanted to talk about this. How do you pronounce this name? Rahima, or?
Well, yeah, Rahima. I think pretty much anything you do with a human mouth and tongue is going to be inaccurate. So
okay.
Go ahead and you should hear me trying to pronounce some of these names. I do not have a particularly good ear.
Well, actually, even just the title of the third book, I wasn't entirely sure how to pronounce, to be honest with you.
Steelies.
Steelies?
Steelies, I think
Steelies?
Yeah. I think there's a bad pun in there.
But speaking of this anthropomorphic cat character, I wrote a story a few years ago featuring an anthropomorphic cat character, or a bunch of them actually. And I was really surprised at how strong people's reactions to that were. Both I got a lot of love from the furry community, and then just a lot of the opposite of love from other quarters. And I was just wondering if you had experienced any of these strong feelings that people have toward these animal characters.
I have yet to have anybody complain about Rahima. I have had some complaints about the magic pony, because, full disclosure, these books do have a magic pony. She's a very sarcastic magic pony, even though she doesn't have any actual lines of dialogue. But no complaints about the kitty that I've seen. Possibly because I did, in writing her, try very, very hard to keep her from ever being cute, and to always bear in mind that even though, she talks and communicates on a human, what would be sort of like a human level, that she's still a, 500-pound, 8-foot tall bipedal carnivore. And sort of always, always keep that in mind and try to show the physical respect that all of the other characters have for her. Because really, I can't think of a whole heck of a lot that's scarier than a tiger with human cognition. They are an incredibly impressive predator. Right up there with polar bears on the, most large predators look at human beings and go, well, okay, that's another large predator. We'll achieve détente and stay away from each other. But, tigers and polar bears are looking at you and doing mental conversions to see whether it's worth the calories to chase you down.
So who would win in a fight between a tiger and a polar bear?
Oh, probably the polar bear.
Yeah.
I think unless the tiger got surprise.
Hmm.
Even a big tiger is not in the same weight class.
What if it was like a bantamweight polar bear versus a tiger?
A bantamweight polar bear and a really big tiger. I think the tiger would probably win that. Cats are extremely well-designed predators.
Hmm. You mentioned the horses, and I did actually want to talk about that, because obviously if it's a Mongolian-style culture, horses play a huge role in the society.
Yes.
Could you just talk a little bit about the role of horses in this book?
Well, they're absolutely necessary to the livelihood of these people. If you don't have a horse, you're dead. And the thing that I'm first of all incredibly fortunate in that my editor and my very good friend and frequent co-author Sarah Monette are both horsewomen. And while I've worked in a stable and I've worked around horses, I haven't been around them extensively in 20 years. So I had the backup of people who actually knew horses very well and could tell me when I was making a mistake, when I was goofing something up.
I mean, what's an example of something that you might goof up without the horse consultants?
Well, for example, there's a one of the magic pony gives birth to a foal at one point in the second book. And I had done a whole bunch of research on horse labor and how it works. But my editor went through and corrected like 5 or 6 tiny little mistakes that added up to a big mistake and increased my verisimilitude massively. And, occasionally she would point out things like, well, a horse wouldn't do this, or a horse would react this way in this situation. Horse psychology is interesting because they're all of the other domestic animals with which we have real partnerships, like dogs and cats, are predators, or at least omnivores in the case of dogs. And the psychology of an herbivore is very different from the psychology of a scavenger or an omnivore. Their entire brains are structured differently. And having Beth Meacham, my editor, to remind me of those moments when she would point out, the horse is acting like a dog here. You need to fix that and make her act like a horse.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just reading reviews, a lot of people really loved this pony character that you were mentioning. And could you just talk about making a horse like a character that people connect with, even though it doesn't have any lines in the book?
Yeah, well, the thing to remember is there are 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 4 horses that are at least secondary characters that have a fair amount of screen time, and their personality and actions have some impact on what happens in the story. And some of it is just remembering that they're not all the same. That they do have their characters. They do have different personalities. There's one mare who's a little flightier and snappier than the other. There's Banch, the magic pony, who's, as I said, she's sarcastic. And horses, having worked around horses do have a sense of humor. And when we talk about a human being having a horsey sense of humor, it's a very accurate description, because horses really delight in pranks and pratfalls and making the monkey look stupid. We had one mare at the stable I worked at where you had to be very careful about walking behind her stall, because she wouldn't kick, but she liked to pee on people. And mares pee backwards like cats. And they can get some actual distance. That is not a splash zone you want to be in. And just so this particular horse is a little bit sarcastic, and especially since none of the human protagonists of the books realize for like the first 300 pages that they're dealing with a slightly supernatural animal here. And I was having a great deal of fun with, having them invent, justifications for whatever had gone on. It was also kind of fun because occasionally she could serve as, the thing about of all the problems with The Dark Knight Rises and all the various plot holes and complaints people had. And then there was the one where, well, how does he get back from the middle of nowhere with no money to Gotham City when it's been walled off? Well, he's Batman. There were a couple of moments in the book where I had the great fun of, how do we get out of this? Well, the pony is Batman. But you have to set that up before you can use it. You don't get that for free. So,
I mean, speaking of movies like that, and possibly problems with movies like that, I recently watched you and Scott Lynch review The Hobbit Part 2 while drunk.
Oh dear, I think I'm still hungover.
Yeah, it sounded like it. You want to just talk about what that was and how that came about?
Well, our buddy Pat Rothfuss has this little tiny charity event he does every year. That was irony, called World Builders, where he raises a whole bunch of money for Heifer International, which is an absolutely great. I'm 100% behind this charity. Basically what they do is they buy livestock for economically challenged people in farming communities and then teach them how to tend that livestock. And in doing so, attempt to create wealth for the entire community. Basically, the World Builders accepts donations and then has stretch goals in a sort of Kickstarter-like fashion. Well, Scott and I were asked to provide a stretch goal. We were thinking about like, oh God, what can we do? What can we do? And it's supposed to be something whimsical or fun or ridiculous. And at some point we were like, well, I think we had just gotten back from seeing The Hobbit, the desolation of Smaug, and being somewhat disappointed.
To put it mildly.
Many of our peers, somewhat feeling a little let down. And one of us said, well, we could just do an audio review of The Hobbit. And the other one said, yeah, drunk, or I'd have to be drunk. And that was... So we emailed Maria, who is the person who runs World Builders for Pat, and said, well, what do you think of this? And she's like, oh my God, do it and provide cocktail recipes. So we did. And there were even more cocktail recipes in the original draft. Each more whimsical and ridiculous than the last. I think the Smaug was my favorite, which is a shot of Goldschlager drunk while it's on fire. We do not recommend actually trying this.
Yeah, it's funny, I haven't seen The Desolation of Smaug because I didn't like the first Hobbit movie at all.
Mm-hmm.
But after it came out, we had Corey Olsen on the show. He's the Tolkien professor. And he gave an amazing defense of it. He was like the F. Lee Bailey of the Hobbit movie. And I'd be curious to hear what he has to say about The Desolation of Smaug because, you guys not big fans, definitely.
No. Well, I really actually, I was willing to forgive a lot of the first one. There were many, many things about the first one that I liked. There was some stuff I didn't like, but the second one I felt I didn't just feel it was a failure on an adaptation level. I felt like it was a failure on a narrative level. Like as its own thing, it didn't work. So too many bobsled rides down luge rides on molten gold.
Yeah. All right. So one thing I really wanted to ask you about is, as a teenager, I was absolutely obsessed with the Amber Diceless role-playing game.
Oh my God.
And I was just looking at your Wikipedia page, and according to that, your first ever short story publication was in Ambersine 11.
It's not actually my first ever short story publication. There were some other earlier ones, one of which I disavow because it was a really terrible story. We don't talk about that. But I played Amber DRPG for a long time and ran a campaign and attended a number of Amber Cons. Met my ex-husband at an Amber Con, actually. I still have an enormous number of friends in that community, and the hysterical thing is the number of professional writers who have come out of that tiny little Amber Con community.
Like who are some of the other ones?
Well, there's Doug Hulick, Jaggy Lamplighter. Of course, now I'm going to forget. But
well, we interviewed Jim Butcher, and he got his start doing an Amber online mush kind of thing.
Yeah. No, it was an enormously. It's not really so much a gaming system as a vague framework, and I think that was what made it really excellent for those of us who just wanted an excuse to get together and play make-believe with our friends.
So what was your story, The Devil You Don't?
Oh, that was actually now I'm going to out myself as the giant nerd I am, because the character who I later repurposed as a protagonist in her own non-Amber world, Mary, started off as one of my Amber characters. And that particular story is basically a character contribution. Is one of as you know, but I'm now explaining to the audience. As you know, one of the ways that an Amber campaign works and that you get more points for your character is by doing some sort of quote unquote character contribution. And I was writing little short stories for my game master. And in this particular story, this character rides into, a Wild West town and gets embroiled in basically the plot, or a mashup of the plots of the American murder ballads, Duncan and Brady and Stagger Lee. It's Roger Zelazny by way of Sergio Leone.
Yeah. So what did that turn into when you made it non-Amber? Okay,
well, the character, and I actually fairly often repurpose stuff from games I've run in completely different ways into fiction. That character wound up being recast from a minor third generation Amberite to I think she was a granddaughter of Luella, if I remember correctly. Being recast from that role to being the littlest Valkyrie, basically, who survived Ragnarok because she panicked and fled the battlefield and is now stuck wandering around a post-apocalyptic, post-cyberpunk universe in All the Windwreck Stars and its sequel novels.
And then do you have other, you say you have other characters that people might recognize that are drawn from your gaming sessions?
Oh, sure. I mean, the basic idea of the character of Jenny Casey from the Hammered books came from a Cyberpunk 2020 game, along with several of her co-characters, supporting characters. The book itself is very much not a Cyberpunk 2020 setting, but that was, put a lot of time into developing my player characters and NPCs, and sometimes it's nice to give them a little life beyond the end of whatever gaming system they were in. Jacob Dust, who's a character in the book Dust, surprisingly enough, was the antagonist of this weird Amber/Courts of Chaos play-by-email game that I ran back in the 1990s. And I had so much fun with him that I didn't want to give him up. Basically, I'm a gigantic nerd.
Well, you've come to the right podcast.
I'm an enormous nerdy nerd, and I keep reusing my player characters and favorite NPCs because I love them and don't want to let them go.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about was I was reading over your blog for the past year or so, and when I joined the Science Fiction Writers of America, I logged into the SFWA forums for the first time.
I'm so sorry.
And I was so repulsed by all the vitriol that I literally never logged in again. And so I was struck that you had a kind of a similar experience.
Yeah, apparently the old SFWA forums have been spun off. They are the ones at sff.net, which is where a lot of the toxicity got concentrated, I think. No longer part of SFWA. They are no longer SFWA forums. They are simply a bulletin board system, and SFWA does not endorse or sponsor them anymore. The new SFWA forums on the SFWA.org site are, I understand now, being a little more closely moderated, and there are a number of people who are attempting to create a more collegial, less toxic environment there. As you know, Bob, I am a huge proponent of the positive changes that have been going on in SFWA over the last 5 years, in attempting to make it a more welcoming environment. But from my blog, I mean, my apology to George Martin is, I assume, the entry that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I actually just this morning was holding in my hand a copy of the shiny new post-kerfuffle SFWA bulletin, and it looks amazing. It's suddenly full of articles on how to manage your social media presence and effective strategies for self-promotion and effective strategies for self-publishing, and how to negotiate the career line between self-publishing and traditional publishing. And suddenly there's like useful information in there. It's amazing what a change it is. So I think that we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, do you maybe want to explain for listeners why you were apologizing to George R. R. Martin?
Oh, the reason I was apologizing to George Martin is that when I first joined SFWA, I too went to the SFWA forums. This was the old SFWA forums, back before there was a new SFWA forums. And I started talking to people and trying to, learn my way. And somebody on the forums asked the question, why aren't young writers joining SFWA? And I'm like, well, I know the answer to that. I was 33 at the time, and I didn't know any better. And I said, well, the reason that young writers aren't joining SFWA is because SFWA has a reputation among my cohort. And for those of you listening, a young writer is anybody under 45, honestly, because it takes 10 years to get to the point with your skill where you're professionally competitive. So if you start writing seriously when you get out of college, you're going to be lucky to be breaking in as a novel writer by the time you're in your early 30s, which is exactly what happened to me and what happens to a lot of people. There are a few annoying geniuses who break in their 20s, like my boyfriend, but we give them a lot of help.
This is Scott Lynch.
Scott Lynch,
in case
yes,
people don't know that.
yes.
Yeah.
The awesome Scott Lynch. And I'm sorry, I was ranting. So I said, well, the reason that a lot of young writers don't want to join SIFWA is because that a lot of the writers in my cohort are women or people of color or queer people or, in some way belong to some group, or trans people, or, feel marginalized. And there is a perception among them that SIFWA is not friendly to marginalized groups. And there were two distinct responses. There were a number of people who were incredibly kind to me and really supportive and very sensible and listened to what I had to say. And even if they didn't agree with me, were like, okay, this is you're reporting what you hear, and this is a valid opinion, even if it's not my experience of SIFWA. Among those people were Harry Turtledove and Tamora Pierce in particular, that I recall. And this was almost 10 years ago now, so other people were also extremely kind to me. I just remember almost being moved to tears by both of them. And then there were a whole bunch of people who basically just didn't want to hear it. And I engaged in the traditional science fiction writer pastime of quitting SIFWA in a huff. Either later that year or the next year, on George Martin's live journal, he was talking about SIFWA and said, well, this is the reason why people should join. And I said, these are the reasons why I'm not a member. And he attempted to educate me, and I was still too butthurt to be moved, essentially. And in the intervening, 8 or 9 years, I have come to realize that he was absolutely correct, that there are a lot of good, valid reasons to join SIFWA, and that the way to change it is to get involved and be the change you want to see. And having, it took me 8 years to grow up enough to make a public apology. But, oh well. Live and learn.
All right, so we're running a little short on time here. Do you just want to highlight some of the other projects you've got going on? Stories, books, whatever?
Yeah, absolutely. We are, Emma Bull and I are currently hard at work on the series finale of Shadow Unit, which is a serialized online quasi-real-time, quasi-interactive episodic narrative that she and I and 6 or 7 other writers have been doing since 2007, and we're coming up to the big finish. There are 2 more episodes now, and a lot of things are going to blow up. All available for free at shadowunit.org, or you can get the first ebook for free, and the others I think are $2.99 at your favorite online ebook retailer. I have just handed in a book called Karen Memory, which is a Wild West steampunk novel starring the heroic hookers of a city that is not quite Seattle and not quite San Francisco in the 1870s. It's so much fun. This is one of those books where I was giggling to myself as I was writing it.
And I think our producer, John Joseph Adams, would want me to mention that you have a story coming out in his Dead Man's Hands, Weird West Anthology.
Yes, which is actually the story that grew into the novel Karen Memory. That story is Madame Damnable's Sewing Circle. And I am also, Sarah Monette and I are working on the long-delayed 3rd book in the Icecrine series. The first book was A Companion to Wolves. This one's called An Apprentice to Elves. And Sarah had some health problems, and the book's been delayed 3 or 4 years, but we're a fifth of the way done with the first draft. This is very promising. I'm very excited. And I just sold 2 space operas to Galance, which should be out starting in 2016. And they're sort of big idea, Ian Banksian, high-risk galactic exploration books with aliens.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, since this is a podcast, a lot of our listeners might be interested to check out the SF Squeecast, which
Indeed.
you're a regular cast member of.
Yes.
What's been going on with Squeakcast lately?
New format this year, actually. We used to do a sort of show and tell format where everybody brought something awesome to talk about. The Squeakcast is a podcast that it's myself, Lynn Thomas, Michael Thomas, Shannon McGuire, Kat Valente, and Paul Cornell, and various guest stars. And the object of the Squeakcast is to talk positively about stuff we love, rather than being all critical and negative, because we can do that on Twitter, or
YouTube.
Or YouTube. But to just really get excited and talk about awesome stuff in the best geek fashion. And we were doing a sort of show and tell format for 2 years. This year we're shaking it up and doing more of a panel discussion of awesome stuff. So we've talked about, our Hugo nominations. These are the things that I really loved in the last year. And we were a 2-time Hugo winning podcast. We have recused ourselves so that it doesn't become the best Squeakcast award for best Squeakcast. And so obviously everybody should be voting for you this year.
Oh, well, unfortunately, since we're a professional podcast, we're not eligible in the podcasting category. But they can nominate us for best related work, but that's a rough category to be.
That is a rough cat. That's tooth and nails clawing up the pile of corpses. Best everybody we don't have an award for.
Yeah.
Well, I tried.
No, I appreciate that. All right, so we're pretty much out of time here. So I'm gonna thank very much Elizabeth Bear for joining us on the show.
Well, thank you, David.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Elizabeth Bear for joining us on the show. And for our panel today, I'll be joined by 2 guest geeks. So first up, we've got my longtime co-host, John Joseph Adams. He's the editor and publisher of Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines, and the series editor of Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. He's also edited many other short fiction anthologies, including the recent trilogy The Apocalypse Triptych, and the upcoming book of Weird West stories, Dead Man's Hand. So John, welcome back.
Thanks, man.
And also joining us today is Daniel H. Wilson, who you may remember from our feature interview back in episode 41. He holds a PhD in robotics from Carnegie Mellon, and is the author of nonfiction books such as How to Survive a Robot Uprising, and novels such as Robopocalypse, a New York Times bestseller that's currently being adapted for film by Steven Spielberg. So Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
And John and Daniel are also the co-editors of the new short fiction anthology Robot Uprisings. And so for our panel today, we'll be discussing the book and talking about robot uprisings in science fiction. Okay, so Daniel, as I mentioned, we last spoke to you back in episode 41, and at that time your novel Robopocalypse had just come out. So why don't you just quickly catch us up on what you've been up to for the past couple of years?
So Robopocalypse came out, and it did really well, and I was really happy to get to keep writing books for a living for a little while longer, at least. And so, it has been in development with DreamWorks for quite a while. Last year, it almost went into production. And then 2 weeks before they were supposed to start filming, it got delayed. But they're still cooking on it. So since then, I've written the sequel to Robopocalypse, which is called Robo Genesis. And that's coming out in June. And of course, I co-edited this Robot Uprisings anthology with John, and contributed a novella for that called Small Things, which was really fun to write, kind of like something longer than a short story, but shorter than a novel. I wrote another novel called Amped that came out. That happened. Trying to think about it. It's been a few years. You guys are all the way up on episode. You're in the hundreds now, right?
Yeah, this will be 107.
I was just baby episode 41 way back in the day.
All right, cool. So yeah, and we'll talk more about the Robot Uprisings book later on in the show. But first, let's talk about a little bit about the history of robot uprisings in science fiction. Because robot uprisings have a long history in science fiction. In fact, the word robot was first introduced to the public by the Czech writer Karl Čapek in his play RUR, which stands for Rossum's Universal Robots, which was published in 1920. So you might say that as long as there have been robots in science fiction, there have been robot uprisings.
So you go all the way back, of course, to that play in 1921. which people loved, by the way. And in RUR, all the robots eventually kill every single human on the planet. I mean, so that happened in the very first, like the creation, the genesis of robots, right? The word robot, which is based on a word that means, laborer or somebody who does drudge work for the man. It's like they started out as a metaphor for like the oppressed working class, right? So they kill every single person on the planet. And then you kind of move forward into like the 30s and 40s, you start getting into pulp science fiction and you get the the early pulp movies, right? Where there's the robots are the bad guys and there's lots and lots of those. And then you get to modern times, right? And we have, of course, like The Matrix is a story of a robot uprising, Terminator, robot uprising. You see lots of iconic robots like Maria from Metropolis or Gort from The Day the Earth Stood Still. And you end up realizing that you're starting to pile up the, HAL 9000 from Space Odyssey 2001. You start noticing that all the robots are evil, right? And you start thinking, oh, well, come on, where are the good ones? And yeah, maybe you've got like Robbie the robot, Danger, Will Robinson. So he's trying to help people, I guess. You've got R2D2 and C3PO, right? They're good, but really, it's pretty obvious that the scales are tipped in favor of us being afraid of these robots as characters. What I think is really fascinating is that we've got, like about 100 years, and this isn't even, by the way, to mention any of the pre-1920 incarnations of robots that were like from Greek mythology or were court automatons, that were developed all throughout the Middle Ages and antiquity. So that's a whole other thing. But you see, we've got 100 years of pop culture where robots are evil, and there are no such thing as robots, And then you start looking like, okay, now in just the last couple of decades, we've really started to get real robots, and it's really fascinating to watch how it's changed things. So now we've got movies like Her and Transcendence coming out, and Robot and Frank, and like, you're starting to see robots that are a lot more complicated than just guys in rubber suits, like trying to steal women. And so, I think that right now there's a real renaissance happening in terms of pop culture and just how we're treating robots in pop culture. And of course, we have 100 years of momentum of evil ass robots that want to kill everybody.
Yeah, speaking of Gort, actually, we dedicated the anthology to GLaDOS and Gort just because we thought that would be funny. But and that of course reminds me that of course we should mention GLaDOS from Portal, the Portal video game. And although I guess it's debatable whether or not she was actually uprising or if she was just programmed to be that way, and she's actually just fulfilling her program. But it certainly seems like she's uprising against something, and she's got
so much personality, I feel like
yeah. I mean, she's definitely evil. I mean, she's not one of those good robots, but
I don't know. I would argue with you about whether GLaDOS is evil.
Okay.
I feel like she's evil in the way that a human being would be evil. Like, like she's misguided. She loves too much. She feels too deep. And this makes her do crazy things. Unlike something, and I think that's fascinating, unlike sort of like something like Skynet, where it's just a malfunction and it's just some sort of computer program that's decided it has one goal, which is just to kill every human. It doesn't care about any nuances or details or anything like that. It just has this one boring thing, like, like a trench digger digs trenches. Like Skynet just tries to kill humans. There's nothing interesting in it,
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, Daniel, I really want your... I mean, we've talked about this on the show before, but I really want your opinion on it. The Irobot movie, because Isaac Asimov wrote all of his robot stories in opposition to this idea of... He was sick of all these evil robots always in science fiction, and he wanted to show a different side of it. And then they adapt his stories into a Robot Uprising Evil Robots movie.
Yeah. Well, they didn't adapt anything of his except the title. So that was a situation where the studio owned the title to the book. And they decided to use it as a marketing tool. So, that movie was not reflective of any of those stories. I mean, really, in any way. I mean, did they even mention like positronic brain? I mean, yeah, I guess they took some of the names of the characters, right? But I mean, who recognized any Asimov in that movie?
I think they grafted some stuff on after the fact because from what I heard, there was a script called Hardwired, which is what was made into iRobot, and then at some point the director started calling it iRobot, even though it wasn't called that, and then so they went on, they got the title and everything, and then once they did, I think they tried to graft on some stuff. The weird thing about it is that the movie actually much more resembles The Caves of Steel, which is an Asimov novel which has robots in it. I mean, it's like sort of a robot detective, a partner with a human, and so it's much more sort of reminiscent of what we see in iRobot. I mean, completely different, but I mean, at least some of the aspects of it are similar. Whereas iRobot, nothing at all like what you see in the movie. I mean, it's like it's not even just like, oh, that's a bad adaptation. No, it's literally nothing like it except that there's already
written. I mean, it was already written as a different movie, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that Asimov had any sort of animus against evil robots. I think he was just on a higher level. He was a techno-utopia. Like, he thought that technology made the world better. And so robots are an emanation of that. Robots are a type of technology, and he thought that they would be useful tools that would make the world better. And, obviously that viewpoint sort of shifted after the 60s and when people started, I mean, in the 60s, people literally didn't want anything natural. They thought technology was going to do everything. You didn't even want to eat natural food. It was like, oh, forget that. It's dirty. It's got dirt on it. Give me a pill, right? Give me a food pill. And obviously once we got all that stuff delivered to us, then we changed our tune. And that was reflected, I think, in science fiction, right? Where we started taking more of a dystopian look at what technology was going to hand to us. I don't know. He did have robots that did lots of bad things, but it was never because they were evil, right? It was because they were malfunctioning.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is there any? I mean, we've mentioned the Terminator and the Matrix. Is there anything more to say about the? You said that there's really not much to Skynet's character, right? Is there really anything to say about the evil robots in any of these movies as characters?
They disappoint me in the movies. I think you got to read if you really want to get into the intricacies, of the and see it hit from a lot of different angles. Like, I'll tell you what, the two most disappointing scenes for me, and not to be negative, by the way, I love Terminator, I love Matrix too, as much as you can love Matrix, with respect to the second and third one. But
there was never any Matrix sequels. What are you talking about?
Oh, I want to live in the universe where you're from. So in Terminator, there's, and I've complained about this before. There's a scene where I think it's in Terminator Salvation. So okay, asterisks, right? It's not. I'm not going to talk any smack about 1 or 2, right? I'm not crazy. I love those. But the guy shows up to Skynet, which is in an office building, and there are chairs everywhere, right? Like, come on, who's at Skynet? Who is sitting in chairs? Nobody, right? It's just a complete disrespect and lack of attention to any kind of detail, right? And it's just sad to me because it's not true to what Skynet would really be. So no matter how boring I think Skynet is, I know for sure that it wouldn't exist in an office building with frickin' chairs after it's decimated humanity years ago. The other thing is in The Matrix, when Agent Smith, who I love, says, you humans are not mammals because you overpopulate. And it's like, you're a robot. You have logic. Like, don't you know the definition of a mammal? Can't you check that against the stupid shit you're saying right now? Like,
don't you have Wikipedia?
Yeah, don't you have like a direct feed to Wikipedia? I mean, you're not a mammal because what the fuck do you think animals do? They overpopulate all the time. Like basic biology. Like, so whenever you see some kind of omniscient robot do something just really stupid or just say something that's just factually obviously not correct, that really disappoints me. And it happens a lot, I feel like, in movies especially, because they're shooting for just an entertaining spectacle, and they're not necessarily as wrapped up as I am in adhering to all the minutia of, how a robot might really behave.
Well, you know what happened there in The Matrix is that Neo actually went into Wikipedia and he vandalized the mammal page. And so when Agent Smith went to access it, he just got wrong information. I mean, it was actually pretty clever.
I do know that humans are reptiles. I believe they are amphibians. I believe you correct me if I'm wrong. Humans are amphibian. That's correct, right? Someone's changing the Wikipedia. Can we lock the Wikipedia? What is happening?
Well, you said that that if you really want good Robot Uprising, characters, you have to go to books. Do you have examples? I mean, the first example for me that comes to mind is the Technocore in Dan Simmons' The Fall of Hyperion. Although it's kind of a spoiler to talk about it too much, but I don't know. Do you guys have examples along those lines you want to mention?
In terms of like just turning this question inside out, I love Dune because they've already had a Robot Uprising in their distant history. And now they've got this total Battlestar Galactica type thing, which is another Robot Uprising to mention, by the way, where they don't use computers anymore to chart their navigation through space, right? They have these people who are called mentats, and they do all the math in their head, right? And like, I love that there's this decision made, like, we're not going to have a lot of robots in this world. And then there's this totally consistent reason that's just built into sort of the epic scope of the Dune novels, like, and not even mentioned, except just to say, yeah, at some point in the past, some really bad shit went down. And then I guess they go through and they describe what it is. I haven't read the Butlerian Jihad, I think.
Yeah.
I've taken a run at it a few times, but for some reason everybody tells me to read it and it just doesn't click, but I'm going to do it. Promise.
All those Dune prequels. Yeah, I was going to say they do detail that robot uprising, but I always thought it was funny. The Butlerian Jihad. I was like, wait, why did the Butlers go on a jihad? I don't understand that. It's like, it's just, when you see the title, it's kind of ridiculous. One of them is called the Machines Crusade, which actually does sound really awesome. But
it always makes me think of Octavia Butler.
Oh yeah, she went on the jihad. Yeah, one woman jihad. But actually, speaking of Battlestar Galactica, I mean, obviously that's one that we haven't really mentioned much yet, and of course that's very much a robot uprising. I mean, the humans create the Cylons, and then they basically try to exterminate them because they go bad or whatever. And but I mean, they're an interesting kind of robot. I mean, I don't know how you feel about them, Daniel. I mean, like, they're very unusual for robots. I mean, they make a lot. I mean, I'm talking about the reboot, not the original, because I don't really know the original very well. But I mean, in the Ron Moore version, I mean, there's a lot of weird choices that they make, especially towards the end of the show. But I mean, I always thought it was kind of interesting that they were really just trying to be as human as possible, and that's what actually drove them to their evil acts, and or at least them uprising against us and trying to destroy us, because they knew that if they were going to be as much like us as possible, they'd have to destroy all of their other direct competitors like that.
Yeah, like that, for me, because I like to stick to the real raw, like, as realistic as I can get it. I just don't believe that it would be impossible physically to examine a robot and a human in terms of doing surgery and shit, and not be able to tell the difference. Because if you can't, I mean, isn't that like some kind of version of the Turing test? Like, if you biologically cannot look at somebody's tissue under a microscope and tell the difference, then what the hell? Why don't they all just, have babies together? They're obviously the same exact species. Like, I'm sure there's some example, and I'm sure that hardcore Battlestar Galactica fans are screaming right now, like, that's totally explained, Wilson. But still, like, I could never really get over that. I never could really swallow that pill and like believe there's really no, and it would take like little Gaius to figure out, like, and he still can't figure it out. I don't know.
I mean, that's totally legit complaint. I mean, that was one thing that was like, I don't know about that. Although it just got progressively worse from there. I mean, the science kind of goes a little wonky with those Cylons, that's for sure. But
the substrate, it determines how the behavior is expressed, right? I mean, if you're a robot, I mean, one good thing about it that I thought was cool was, since they couldn't really die, they did have a completely different outlook on the world, right?
Mhm.
And you see that in like torture scenes and things like that. They're like, well, my shit's gonna get downloaded, so
Mhm.
and so like their substrate, like the way they're built, was different than humans at least in that respect. And so you did see some different kind of behavior there. But I actually have a super secret personal favorite all-time Robot Uprising story, which is not quite a Robot Uprising, but it's something that inspired me for years and years. And I'm going to tell you about it whether you want to hear it or not. But so when I was a little kid, when I was like about 10, my dad had a ton of science fiction novels, in his office, and I absconded with them one at a time and read them all, whether I was ready or not. And one I read was called Sea of Glass by Barry Longyear.
Mhm.
And so Barry Longyear wrote Enemy Mine, which is probably his most famous book because it was turned into a movie. What is Lou Gossett Jr.? Talks like that the whole time. I love it. What's the guy's name? I forget. Anyway, so the thing about Sea of Glass, which is crazy, is it's all about this central AI that gets created called Mac. And this machine basically, for the civilized part of the world, figures out everything to maximize resources. But there's an uncivilized part of the world that's not obeying any kind of like belt tightening strategies. And the way that they describe it is it's like a submarine where one half of the crew is like overpopulating and using up the resources, and the other half is wringing more and more resources out of less and less. But there's going to be a moment where they have to fight, right, over the remaining resources. And that's called the war date. And this entire fucking novel, I'm just going to blow. Should I blow the end?
Yeah, go for it. I mean, what is it, like 30 years old?
Yeah, it's 30 years old. So here's the crazy ass beautiful thing about Sea of Glass. The story is about a kid who's illegal because you're not allowed to have that many kids. And he basically endures the worst, most perverse abuse throughout his entire life. It scars him. It makes him into this very unique individual. And he ultimately ends up infiltrating Mac in order to get revenge. And he basically ends up pulling the triggers that initiate this world war that kills billions of people. And at the very end, you realize that the entire time he was off the grid and running from this omniscient machine that had tendrils all over the world, it knew where he was. And it was basically causing him to have these experiences so that he'd be the perfect sort of person who could pull those triggers and murder like 3 billion people and save the world. And it's like such a mind fuck when you get to the end and you realize that you're rooting for a guy who makes Hitler, look like a toy poodle. Anyway, it's a terrific book. And the crazy thing about the book, the thing that gives me goosebumps is I read it a lot when I was like in middle school, and then I forgot about the book. And then halfway through my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, I realized my thesis was building Mac. I was building basically an AI that used distributed sensors to model human behavior and predict what people would do in the future, and then modify environmental variables to cause some kind of behaviors that you want to occur and behaviors that you don't want to not occur with basically changing the probabilities of what people would do based on modifying environmental variables based on having an accurate model of how people behave.
Did it ever occur to you that maybe alien AIs were beaming lasers into Barry Longyear's brain to get him to write that book to get you to invent AI?
Oh my God! No, I didn't, but I like that. Yeah. Oh, you know what? I'm close, but I'm not quite narcissistic enough to think that that anything would be planted in order to get my thesis out of it. It was an okay thesis, but I don't think I didn't rock the world with it.
All right, let's go to some listener comments. Zach Chapman says the Mass Effect series has a very epic robot uprising on a galactic scale. Anyone ever played Mass Effect?
Yeah, the Geth, dude. They're artificial life forms, and they're like, I guess they ally themselves with the Reapers in order to, or maybe they're actually part of the Reapers. Did you guys play?
I have not played it, yeah.
Well, so John and I just sold an anthology called Press Start to Play to Vintage, and we're getting stories from Hey, correct me if I'm wrong. Are we getting a short story contributed by the person who wrote the storyline for Mass Effect?
Well, Mac Walters, he wrote. I think he wrote Mass Effect 2 and 3.
Because we got all these contributors who write for World of Warcraft, or they write Portal, Ted Kosmatka and stuff. And so I'm really curious to see what they come up with. But the Geth are artificial. They're basically like robots, but I actually think of them as more like living creatures that just happen to be made out of plastic and metal and stuff.
Yeah, well, like Arthur C. Clarke has that thing, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and maybe any sufficiently advanced robot is indistinguishable from a living thing, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I get into in Robo Genesis, the sequel to Robo Apocalypse. I love thinking about that, and there are some real world robots that do this. Like there's this thing called Eater, EATR. It's a little old now, but it has like a biomass combustion chamber, and it just goes around and collects biomass and then jams it into its little chamber, and then it keeps going. And it's like there was another one, I can't remember what it's called, Slugbot maybe, but it's this little robot that goes around in a field and it picks up slugs and puts them into this little container that has some sort of chemical reaction going that dissolves the slugs and gives it energy to keep looking for more slugs. And, right now this stuff is really clumsy and shitty, but that's how animals operate, right? I mean, you introduce a few more aspects of that, and you've got real feral robots wandering around the wild, keeping themselves alive.
No, Daniel, that is not how mammals operate. I don't know where you got that idea.
That's exactly what an amphibian would say.
We also had a listener comment from Anthony James on Facebook. I thought this was a good point. He says, one thing I don't often see is factions, he says, aside from Transformers. He says, there's this assumption that it will be a clean-cut battle of robots versus humans in an uprising, but what's to say all the robots will be united? They might destroy each other before they destroy us.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, dude, I know. I'm with him 100% on that. And same thing, that's exactly what I'm doing in the latest novel, too. Like, so there's this really great quote. I'm kind of looking for it right now, but I can't find it. It's this guy, I think it's at the Singularity Institute website, where people like sort of pontificate about threats from the singularity and things. And there's an article in there about basically the fact that AIs are not a natural class, right? So every AI could have been formed completely differently on different architecture. There's no guarantee that they would think the same, even to the extent that they would even be able to perceive each other or speak the same language or much less have the same goals, or decide to work together on something. So I love that. I love the idea that there could be just potentially thousands and thousands of totally different alien minds that are out there that have all been generated, like just AIs that have been sparked on some kind of advanced hardware out there competing against each other in our world. And of course with us here as like ants trying not to get stepped on.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Let's talk about this Robot Uprisings anthology. John, why don't you tell us, how did this come about?
Well, it was actually right after we interviewed Daniel. I think I'm pretty sure is when I was thinking more about Robot Uprisings and stuff after the interview, and so I thought I would like to do an anthology on the subject. But then I thought, well, it would be cooler if I could have somebody like Daniel as a partner on it who like really knows robots inside and out, and so thus could actually advise the authors if necessary on the robotics in their stories, so that we can not only do a fun Robot Uprisings anthology, but one that actually, would make sense to a roboticist and wouldn't, have them be like, robots wouldn't behave that way. So I pitched it to Daniel and see if he wanted to do it. And he had written a story for my Mad Scientist Guide anthology. And so, and of course we'd interviewed him. So I kind of knew him at that point. And so he was on board, and then, we went about pitching it around, and so we ended up selling it to Vintage, which was pretty exciting. And, that Vintage is Vintage publishes Daniel's books in paperback, and he had sold his novels to Doubleday, and, which is all part of Random House. And, so, I mean, that's really exciting just because, I hadn't had an anthology at that level from a publisher yet. I anthologies from Tor, and I did have one from Simon and Schuster, but it was YA, and so it was kind of different. And so like this is my first venture, in the adult side of things, where we're getting out on like really mainstream, mass market type of level, where it's going to be all over bookstores. It's going to have like prominent co-op placement in Barnes and Noble, so meaning it's going to be out on tables and all that kind of stuff. And Random House is one of the biggest publishing houses in the world, so that was very cool. But it basically started with our Geeks Guide interview of Daniel, and I say, hey, robot Uprisings, those are fun, those are cool. Let me see if Daniel wants to do that.
Well, and I grew up sending short story attempts to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and like getting rejection slips. And so when I got older and I realized, and I had, I'd written Robopocalypse, and I realized, holy shit, I'm actually really a science fiction writer, I realized John is so plugged into this world, and he knows so many amazing authors that I was actually just kind of like starstruck, and I was like, "What?" Like, I would be crazy excited to contribute to an anthology, but to actually get to edit one and read stories, and then actually even offer my advice. Trust me, I wasn't like trying to correct anybody. And then, of course, I did get to flex my science muscle, which, trust me, you don't want to see it. And the story one story that I'm really super excited about in the anthology, it was written by Dr. John McCarthy, who is the guy who coined the term artificial intelligence in the 50s. He came up with the term artificial intelligence. Like, he's widely considered the father of the field, and he wrote the programming language Lisp way back in the 60s, an AI programming language that, I learned in college. And so this guy's just like a hero. He passed away in 2011, but I knew he always had this one short story on his website at Stanford, and they left it up for posterity. And it's unedited, and it's just really thrown together. And then at the bottom, there's this sort of wry note that says, maybe someday I'll even try to get this published, So we dug it up, and we read it and realized this is a great story. And the guy wrote countless books and articles and, never wrote any fiction, right? So we contacted, and this again is where John's expertise came in handy, because he's like a pro at this. I mean, who better? We contacted his relatives, his surviving relatives, and we got the rights to the story. And then I found myself editing John McCarthy. And even better, and this is where I really geek out, so excuse me, but his story actually has Lisp code in it. And not only did I have to edit his story and fix the grammatical stuff, I had to debug his code and actually like match up all of the parentheses and stuff like that. So, I mean, for me, that was just so ridiculous and funny and awesome. And like I said, the story is amazing. I mean, it's prophetic. It's actually a really quality story. So, that was just sort of one of the little highlights for me of just teaming up with John and like geeking out and being able to put this thing together and contributing to it as well. I had a fun story that I really enjoyed writing. So yeah, what about you, John? I mean, what's your favorite? Not to, pick favorites, but
yeah, I mean, I really love Scott Sigler's story that's in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, if anybody wants to check it out, you can read it for free in Lightspeed, because we reprinted it in Lightspeed in the April issue. And so if you go to the Robot Uprisings website, you can also find a link to it there, which is just johnjosephadams.com/robot-uprisings. But yeah, Scott Sigler, like, I mean, I've been a fan of his stuff over the years, and and certainly been aware of him a long time, even before I ever checked out his fiction. But I mean, I don't think I'd ever read any of his short fiction. I only knew him as a novelist. So we invited him to this. And so when he turned in his story, I was just like, wow, I just like liked it so much. And it was really exciting. And so, we actually lit off the book with that one. But, I mean, yeah, it's like, like as an anthologist, you don't want to name too many stories as your favorites or whatever. You don't want to single them out and make other people feel bad that they're not your
Which
favorite.
one did you like the least?
Yeah. No. But I mean, one of my other favorites in the book is one of the reprints. The book is almost all original, but we have a few reprints in there, and one of them is a story called "Spider the Artist" by Nnedi Okorafor, who again was one of our previous guests on Geek's Guide. But and that was a story I actually first published in my anthology Seeds of Change, which was my second book back in 2008, and it's just this really interesting take, this unique take on robots, and it takes place in Africa. It's in Nigeria, and the robots are working on this like oil pipeline thing, and it's like a really sort of powerful type of story. Like, a woman has this relationship with this robot that she meets, and yeah, it's really it's got this really creepy vibe once you get through the end of it, and it's I've always really loved that story, and so I'm glad
one's such a good clash of like gritty everyday sort of life in a really like sort of messed up third world place with very little technology, and then just this crazy advanced technology that's just there. It's like someone broke the prime directive or something. Or it's kind of like how everybody's got cell phones now in like super rural Africa, and you realize like people are getting technology out of order, right? We get our technology. We all had the advantage of having a telephone, then having like an 80s brick, car phone. Then you get a little bit of a smaller thing, and we're on this iterative journey, in the first world. And then it's so interesting to jump into another place where they're just super advanced technology is just showing up and clashing. It kind of reminds me of like a District 9 vibe. But yeah, I also love that one.
Now, I mean, I think when people hear the phrase robot uprising, they think about like the Irobot movie kind of thing, where there's these androids, these human-shaped robots, and just all of a sudden they just start picking up wrenches and smacking people over the head. How many stories in the book follow that sort of template, and how many are something completely different?
I'd say 2 or 3, right? Out of 17.
Yeah, not that many follow that template. I mean, it's mostly like kind of really out there type of uprising scenarios. So I mean, they feel very novel. Like I hadn't read them before, so that was very cool.
The most out there one, the one that blew my mind, was Sleepover, right?
Oh yeah.
The Alistair Reynolds. Is it okay for me to like describe that one, or do you think it would give away too much?
I don't think I mean, as long as you don't, go everything that happens at the end, I think it's probably fine.
Oh man, but everything that happens at the end is that's the part that blows your mind. Well, basically the idea is this. The vague idea is that the world now, everybody's asleep. Everybody is in these huge concrete cubes where they're safe, and they're all asleep. And the reason they're asleep is because they've discovered that, and this boils down to actually physics, right? Every time you observe the world, you force the world to basically simulate itself, right? So everything exists in a superposition on like a quantum level until you observe it, and then it picks. It chooses which one it's going to be, and then so we make reality by experiencing it. But the idea is that by forcing the universe to express itself to us, it uses up essentially bandwidth, and there are reasons why this is bad, and so and like epic reasons, and so whenever they explore that kind of concept, it ends up being really a mind-blowing thing that, I mean, I had never thought of anything like that before. And especially not something that's so dead on perfect for a robot uprising.
Yeah, actually, I mean, the book is so varied in terms of what kinds of uprisings are happening in there that I'm almost a little worried that it might be a little bit too novel for like sort of a wide mainstream audience, just because like, you see the book Robot Uprisings and you're probably like a lot of people are probably imagining what Dave is saying. It was like, oh, it's about robots who suddenly pick up a wrench and whack people over the head, whatever.
But I mean, enough stories like that,
It's just like some of them are, like you said, like they're so out there. I mean, I think it's awesome, and I mean, and hopefully people will be cool with it. I mean, I'm hoping that we can sort of lure them in with the how awesome it sounds, like just in terms of on the the sort of the gut level of what you assume it is, and then just sort of blow their minds because it's like so out there that they hadn't even considered that. So I'm hoping that we can win over people with that.
There's a Goodreads review, our very first one, which is incredibly in-depth.
Oh, really? Okay.
And reviews each story, actually, on a scale of 0 through 5.
Mhm.
And this person that reviewed gave it a 5-star review. It looks like it's 4 out of 5, but they loved it. I mean, they raved about almost every story. But I have to say, what's interesting is this really detailed review. They didn't like the generic, what they considered generic robot uprising stories, and I found that pretty interesting. So it was the exact opposite. This one person, which I think it's a reviewer, so I think there's a website associated with it, but Drunken Dragon Reviews. They actually had the opposite view on that. So
Cool. Yeah, I mean that's actually interesting. I mean, I like seeing that kind of varied reaction to an anthology sometimes. Just because it's like when reviews come in and all the different reviews, like somebody loves, like somebody's favorite story is a different one each time. That's sort of the mark of a success of an anthology.
Even you and I, right? It's interesting that you and I have actually significantly different taste in what we like. Like we didn't. I think, you and I, of course, rated all the stories that we considered for this. And I think whenever the stories were just great, it was we agreed, but the ones where it was in the middle or they were more experimental, we often had situations where I was like, so clearly this one, has got to be reworked. And you're like, are you kidding? This is the best thing since
Yeah.
So even just between us, I think there's some variance, but that's actually great, because we ended up, I think, taking having a little bit of an average between two people that are very informed and read a lot of science fiction, and we ended up with the best stuff, I feel like.
Yeah. Actually, one case where we differed was on Daniel's story. On a scale of 1 to 10, he rated it 100, and I rated it merely a 99. So, I mean, that was one where we didn't really quite agree.
I think we really did do that, right? That's really what we wrote on the Google Doc spreadsheet.
It is, yeah.
I really am my number one fan.
Well, yeah, Daniel, why don't you tell us about your story?
Sure. So my story is called Small Things. And it's basically about nanotechnology. So it's about which I promise never to write about because I feel like nanotechnology is so often abused and used for any kind of magical bullshit that you want to happen. And so it's like, oh, it's nanotech. Oh, he can fly because it's nanotech. Or, oh, the bullet didn't go into him because it's nanotech. So in this case, I tried to take I read, Drexler, The Engines of Creation, and I, tried to talk to nanotech experts and really ground this so that there were real rules about how this worked. And of course, how it breaks and how it, infects everybody. Actually, the Stevenson novel, Diamond Age, is also pretty good if you're trying to get into the mindset of just like, really what would nanotech how would it transform our society? How could it? But it's the story basically of a disgraced scientist who gets recruited by the military for this mission to go to this island and deal with out of control nanotech. And so it's got, I based it thematically on Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and kind of the theme of that story, the widely agreed upon theme, is that it's about how the creation of civilization is barbaric, right? People are out in Africa and they're trying, the British are out there, it's, colonial Britain, and they're trying to create civilization, but the actual act of doing that is incredibly barbaric and dark and horrifically awful. And I feel like there's a real parallel there with technology and its capacity to change our world, because anytime a new technology shows up, it changes everything. And the act of changing something is violent. It means you're destroying what's already there, right? And so you think of technology as just constantly locked in this cycle of destruction and creation. And that's exactly what these nanotech particles are doing that are escaped. They're changing everything that they touch from one thing to another. And so, as this guy gets closer to the center of the island, he meets there's a Kurtz-like character there in the center of the island who's this mad scientist who's sort of responsible for this big mess. And I won't give away what happens, but things get way the fuck out of hand. Like things get out of control. It becomes very phantasmagorical. So you can imagine these in the book, they're called cretes. These nanotech particles are designed to work magic tricks. So they're designed to, you sprinkle them on a block of wood, or you find some carbon in the environment, or anything organic, and it'll convert that substrate into something useful, right? Like a gun, or like a Chobham tank armor or something. And so this shit gets loose on the wind, and man, it ain't pretty. What happens? There's also, so I'm talking like deep themes and all that stuff. On a high level, it's an adventure story. It's very similar in my mind to like Jurassic Park, where you've got a scientist who's worked his whole life on something that he's never seen, and then gets dropped into a place where he comes face to face with what he always dreamt of, and realizes it's about to eat his lunch for him.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me though that one of the, your story in particular, I think, is one of the examples where this book sort of crosses over into like techno thriller territory, like in a good way. I don't mean to use that in a pejorative sense or anything, but I mean like, Michael Crichton type of stuff. And I mean, I'm really interested in that kind of thing, and sort of trying to branch my anthologies out to maybe reach that audience. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to try to do something like this, on this sort of mainstream level, like with someone like Daniel, so that we can maybe get that audience, because I think a lot of those people would read, a lot of the awesome science fiction that I know and love, if it was just presented to them in the right way. And that audience, has sort of come up, reading Michael Crichton and whatnot. And, if we can get them to read stuff like this and realize that, oh, like, hey, this is not that different than that. I think that's always a good thing.
Well, yeah, I think we did a good job sort of blending those two, Jeff Abbott, who he writes spy thrillers. And what I love about Jeff is I met him at a McKee Story conference in LA one time, and we just hit it off. He is actually huge in the UK. He's one of the top thriller writers out there. Everything that he writes in the UK is like a bestseller. And he's an American guy. He lives in, I think, Texas. And like, for whatever reason, his sensibility just is super appealing in the UK. So of course, he goes and writes a spy thriller Robot Uprising story, which I just love, like seeing the Robot Uprising reflected through these different genres, of writing. And we have the more experimental stuff like Alistair's Sleepover Story, but we also get just the heart-pounding like spy thriller version of this, and then we have like the more literary and thoughtful stories, like from Charles Yu and Anna North, where they're not violent authors. Charles wrote what was it? How to
Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe.
Yeah, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional. I mean, it's like very sweet. Or Ernie Klein, like. These aren't people who typically write like really violent stuff, and they've written Robot Uprising stories that are kind of sweet, which totally surprised me getting into this. And in fact, I was thinking, is it going to be too violent? Is it just going to be story after story of just, humans getting their asses kicked by robots?
I think we ended up balancing it pretty well. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and I think part of that was by picking the right authors, to make sure that we got a little taste of a lot of different things.
Yeah.
In our last episode, I interviewed Carl Schrader, and in his book, the AIs have replaced all law and lawyers and judges and juries and everything have all been replaced with AI. And in the comments, somebody said, "Well, why would all the laws are passed by politicians and lawyers. Why would they pass laws to make themselves obsolete?" And I responded to that, and I said, well, wait a minute. Why do politicians do anything? It's because they're being bribed with campaign contributions to do whatever people want, right? So maybe AIs would secretly funnel all this money through these dark money groups to politicians to get them to pass laws, giving AIs ever more power. And the AIs, the robots, would take over that way by taking advantage of our corrupt political system. And that would be a non-violent I was like, man, that's a really good idea. I wish I had thought of that before you guys published your Robot Uprisings.
Well, that's kind of in Robopocalypse. There's a part where a robot where the evil AI infiltrates a doll that's in the daughters of a senator's house, or I think a senator's daughter's doll gets infiltrated and starts talking to the girl and trying to convince her mother to not be there for a certain vote, and it's just like super complicated and devious, which is how AIs would be. One of my favorite little sort of examples of something like you're talking about is in John McCarthy's story, where there's a robot nanny that's on the street with a baby because it's been told to go outside, but it won't tell people who it belongs to because of all these privacy constraints that are out there about what private robots that are in your home can share with other people, right? Because who's going to buy? Yeah, like we all use, Google Mail or Microsoft Mail or whatever, and we all kind of know that the government can like spy on everything that we write. But are we going to have robots in our houses that can look at us and record everything about our lives and everything we say and do in our own homes? Are we going to really buy a robot if we know that Google can just or that the cops can just, file a motion and get access to all that data? And so you start to see how the real politics of the world would affect something as common in science fiction as like a robot butler that's in your house. I mean, this guy really actually thought about the actual repercussions. He didn't just invoke the robot butler and just rely on pop culture and all the momentum of all the bullshit that we've already seen on television over the last 50 years to fill in the blanks,
All right, cool. So we should probably start wrapping this up. Just finally, do you guys have any other upcoming projects or anything you want to mention? Daniel, you want to tell us a little bit about? Why don't you tell us a little bit about Robo Genesis and anything else you've got going on?
Okay, yeah. So that's my next project. It comes out in June, and it's a novel that's the sequel to Robopocalypse. Basically, Robo Genesis starts a couple of minutes after Robopocalypse ends, and it just blows the world wide open, makes it a much bigger world, and we really get into, it's the fact that it's maybe not just one AI that's trying to kill human beings, and that everybody's motivations are much more complicated. So we follow, Grey Horse Army back to Oklahoma. There's, Cormac and Shara are still out there. Matilda, Takeo, and Makiko, I pick up with them. And then I have a lot of new characters that kind of jump in. Some of them even live through the book till the end. But, actually I have there's a short story that I wrote for an anthology called, it was Chris Golden's anthology, 21st Century Dead, where it's a zombie anthology, but basically in Robopocalypse at the very end, there's this horrific situation where these robots are mounting the bodies of dead soldiers and like reanimating them and picking up their weapons and firing at their old squad mates. And in Robo Genesis, you realize, and also in this short story called Parasite, that's in that anthology, you realize that these people aren't dead and that these are also mobile surgery stations and that they're preserving the people's, basically they're keeping their heads alive. And so I guess I just, the shit gets real in Robo Genesis. But I mean, I had a great time writing. I'm really proud of it. I think it really expands on the world of Robopocalypse, and I made it a lot longer than Robopocalypse was. I also solidified sort of the narrative style so that you really get to stick with the characters, and there's more character development, and you just go in deeper. And so, all my friends and the people that I've have been reading the advanced reading copies and stuff have been telling me sort of reticent. They're like, well, I liked it better than Robopocalypse. Sorry. And I'm like, that's not an insult. I mean, it's one of the two has to be better. I'd rather it be the one I wrote, more recently, where presumably I'm getting better, right? And not worse at this whole racket. But so that's Robo Genesis. It's coming out in June. I'm really excited about it. And the other thing I'm up to that's sort of big is still secret, unfortunately. But it looks like I'm going to be doing some work for DC Comics. But I'm not really at liberty to talk about the specifics yet. But I'm very excited about that as well.
All right, cool. And John?
Oh, yeah. So, I've got so much going on, which is one of the reasons I am no longer the regular co-host of Geek's Guide. But, as Daniel mentioned, we just sold Press Start to Play, a video game themed anthology to Vintage. And so we'll be working on that in the near future. But coming up right now, The End Is Nigh just came out. And that's the first volume of the Apocalypse Triptych, which is a series of 3 anthologies, and showcasing the different aspects of the apocalypse. So The End Is Nigh is before the apocalypse, and then we do during the apocalypse, and then after the apocalypse. And so that's in progress. Robot Uprisings just came out. Next month, May, we have Dead Man's Hand, which is a weird Western anthology. And then let's see, June, my magazine Lightspeed, we're going to publish our Women Destroy Science Fiction special issue, which is guest edited, not by me, guest edited by Christy Ant, our longtime assistant editor, and also my wife. But she was chosen because she was our longtime assistant editor.
Full disclosure.
So that comes out in June, and then July, my Kickstarter anthology, Help from My Robot Army and Other Improbable Crowdfunding Projects, that comes out, which we kickstarted last year. And then in September, Volume 2 of the Apocalypse Triptych, The End Is Now, comes out. So that just gets us through the end of 2014. And then I've got a whole bunch of stuff for 2015 lined up too. But, I'll be here all day if I tell you about all that. So that's the best thing to do. Go to my website. You can sign up for my anthology newsletter, follow me on Twitter, all that kind of stuff. So you want to keep up with it all.
Yeah, and we're planning to have John back on when Dead Man's Hand comes out in a month or so. So all you John fans can get more of your John fix pretty soon.
Woo-woo.
And we need to go now because Daniel has a call he's going to take from DC to discuss all sorts of exciting secret things. But I had a really good time talking to you guys, and thanks so much for being here, and talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
And that was our panel. So thanks again to Daniel H. Wilson and John Joseph Adams for appearing as guest geeks. And of course, big thanks again to Elizabeth Bear for being our guest today. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Bunmer in the US and 545-81674 in Canada. 545-81674 writes, Geektastic. This has become one of my favorite podcasts. Dave interviews many wonderful writers, scientists, video game creators, etc. He always has insightful questions and follow-ups, and has a sly sense of humor that sneaks up on you. The panel discussions afterward also have great guests and are really engaging. There's a boisterous sense of nerdy camaraderie. I really like the combination of dry wit and hyper-detailed analysis and breakdown that Dave brings to the panel. So thank you 545-81674 for that great review. And of course, a special thank you to all of our crowdfunders, including our newest supporters Vlad Levin, crowdfunder number 71, and Spencer Gessner, crowdfunder number 72. We also had recent contributions from longtime listeners Andrew Johnson, crowdfunder number 45, and Jonathan Pottle, crowdfunder number 7. Jonathan also just became the latest listener to be making monthly contributions to the show. So huge thanks to all of you. To learn more, visit our website at geeksguideshow.com and click on crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.